Hello, everyone. I'm Nikoli, and I'd like to talk to you about some work we're doing at the Scalable Parallel Computing Lab on using deep learning for weather prediction and ensemble post-processing, and some of the HPC infrastructure that we've been developing in order to help enable this. Now, this is not just my work. This is contributions from the whole SPCL team. And now let's just dive in. So, as I think everyone knows, deep learning is sort of a conflux of high-performance computing leading to better models, which we can then use to improve applications of interest. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these. And I'll first focus on applications, where we're introducing a new dataset, ENS10, for post-processing numerical weather prediction ensembles. And I'll also talk a little bit about weather prediction using the community WeatherBench benchmark. And this leads to models, where we're going to look at how ResNets work for weather prediction, sort of an overview of how you might think about analyzing these. And also how or whether, indeed, vision transformers work for weather prediction. And finally, I'll turn to the high-performance computing that is enabling this. Now, of course, HPC is a gigantic area, so I'll split this into three slightly less large areas. And on the I/O side, I'll talk about NOPs, some work we've done to develop an I/O middleware for improving the performance of machine learning I/O. And I'll also talk about DaCeML, a new data-centric machine learning framework that we're introducing that can improve the performance of various deep learning training workloads without requiring significant user intervention. And finally, a warning, there is, of course, research ahead here. Some of this has not been published, and in fact, some of this is this is the first time I'm talking about it. Be aware. Now, let's dive right in. I think many of you are aware of what it means to post-process a numerical weather prediction ensemble, but let's just run through it quickly. You, of course, have your numerical weather prediction code that produces some prediction for the weather. But then you use this to generate ensemble members by perturbing the initial conditions. And this will give you a so-called biased distribution over quantities of interest. And this is biased because there may be systematic issues with your data ingestion, the way your model runs, and so on. And the goal of post-processing is to correct this output distribution, to provide some system to improve this distribution. And there are a lot of approaches for this, things like EMOS or Bayesian model averaging to simple neural networks. And this, of course, gives you a corrected distribution. But there's actually been a lot of interest lately in using deep learning for post-processing. But this suffers from the fact that there isn't a standard community benchmark for this. Lots of people run their experiments on their own versions of their dataset. It makes it very hard to compare. So to address this, we are introducing ENS10 in collaboration with the ECMWF. This is a dataset designed specifically for post-processing ensemble weather forecasts from numerical weather prediction systems. This dataset contains 20 years of data produced by the ECMWF's production forecast model, with 10 ensemble members producing 3 forecasts a week at quite high spatial resolution and with a number of relevant variables. I'm not going to dive into too much detail, but I do want to note that if you are interested in our demos, these are available on GitHub, along with instructions on how to download it. Or if you prefer, there's also a ClimateLab plugin for ENS10 if you want to download it that way. So let's look at how you use ENS10 for this post-processing task. And I'll define it a little more formally in just a moment. So you have your ensemble members, and these are now drawn from the ENS10 dataset, which of course gives you this biased distribution we were talking about before. Now, your task is to provide this system for correcting and improving this distribution to produce this final corrected distribution. And then we'll use the ERA5 reanalysis dataset from ECMWF as the ground truth with which we can score your corrected distribution. To be a little more formal, the task is prediction correction, where at a given time t and for some set of ensemble members, you don't have to use all of them. You want to predict a corrected CDF for some variable 48 hours in the future. And to evaluate this, we'll use two different metrics. The first is Continuous Ranked Probability Score, CRPS. This essentially measures the improvement in forecasting skill that you get across the entire world. But of course, this is sort of an average. And what we really care about in many cases is not the average improvement, but how well you do in challenging circumstances like extreme weather. And for this, we're introducing the EE-CRPS, Extreme Event Weighted CRPS, where we weight the CRPS by the Extreme Forecast Index for that date and location. Now, using this, we also are providing a suite of baseline models and evaluations for them that you can use. And with that, I want to encourage you all to please beat our baselines and develop this emerging nascent field of using deep learning for post-processing weather prediction ensembles. And now with that, I want to turn from post-processing to predicting weather directly using the WeatherBench benchmark. This is a standard community benchmark. We are not introducing this. Basically, the way it works is you get the state of the world at time t equals 0. This is drawn from the ERA5 dataset typically, and you use a model, typically a neural network, to predict the weather, or certain variables at least, 3 and 5 days in the future. Now, this is, of course, a challenging task. We're trying to predict weather, but I think we can learn a lot from this about what networks work well for weather. And if we look at the current state of the art, this is a ResNet trained by Raspin theory that actually performs quite well on this task, where they're predicting the geopotential at 500 hectopascals and temperature at 850 hectopascals, again, 3 and 5 days in advance. But this raises an interesting question. Why do ResNets work well for this task? This is not a criticism by any means. In fact, a ResNet is exactly where I would start for this. But it is still an interesting question because it's not clear why ResNets should work well for this. In fact, because ResNets were originally designed for image classification, and convolution induces some strong inductive biases, for example, translation equivariance, it's not clear that we want these. Nevertheless, they seem to work quite well. And let's dive in just a little bit to see how these work. This is sort of a reconstruction of some of these key aspects of this network and an illustration of how you can sort of dive deeply into neural networks and understand them. So this is the reported results for Raspin theory's ResNet, pre-trained on climate data and then trained on ERA5. And this is it trained only on the ERA5 dataset. And for the rest of this talk, we're only going to be looking at models trained on the ERA5 dataset. We reproduce this ourselves. The performance is a little better just because of some slightly different hyperparameters. But why does this ResNet work well? This ResNet is essentially a variant of ResNet 34. It's a little deeper. There are some other architectural changes. But what changes are important? And to sort of start getting at this, I'll pull off the shelf my favorite network, ResNet 50. You have to make some slight adjustments for it to even work on this data set, but that's fairly trivial. But you see, it performs terribly. Interestingly, despite the fact that it's using almost 4 times as many parameters, this ResNet 50 is performing quite badly. So let's try and figure out why. The first thing, if we compare these two networks, is that the max pooling in the trunk of the network has been replaced by a strided convolution. And if we do this, we see a large performance improvement. Now we can look at the other aspect of this network, the downsampling that occurs in it. And it turns out that if we downsample in only the last 2 blocks of the ResNet, we get a very large performance improvement, almost to where we were before. So it turns out that downsampling destroys information. And in a sense, this should perhaps not be so surprising in retrospect, given the structure of architectures like UNets, which specifically try to preserve the higher resolution data. So downsampling is important. There are a bunch of other tricks that you can apply. I'm not going to go into details. For example, periodic padding to increase the receptive field and some other architectural changes. And with this, we actually get a network that performs quite well. It outperforms the original Rasp-in-Theory ResNet only when not using extra data. We haven't tried the pre-training yet. And the prediction quality actually looks pretty reasonable. So that's the key point with ResNets, is to try and go through the architectural changes and understand what's important. But of course, if ResNets work well, then perhaps vision transformers should work even better, since they're often providing state-of-the-art results in image classification now. So let's pull out a vision transformer, just a standard one, and try it. And as we can see, the performance is quite bad. In fact, it's even worse than the ResNet 50 without any modifications. And we can compare the forecast from the ResNet 50. This is the predictions for geopotential at 500 hectopascals, temperature at 850 hectopascals. This is the ground truth. And this is the vision transformers prediction. Again, same ground truth. We can see that it's sort of losing a lot of the fine-grained detail. It's not really performing quite so well on this. So why is this? Well, we can go back to what we learned from going through the ResNets and pull out our box of tricks. And the first one, of course, was to avoid downsampling. Now, you might not think that vision transformers actually do downsampling, but they process the input in terms of patches, by default 16 by 16 patches. And these are then embedded as tokens, which are then attended between. So you can think of this patch size as corresponding to a downsampling. So if we go from the 16 by 16 patch to a 2 by 2 patch, we perform much, much better. Unfortunately, if we go all the way to a 1 by 1 patch, we are no longer performing quite so well. And in fact, we have to shrink the hidden dimension because of some memory issues. And if you compare the forecast of this larger patch size to the smaller patch size, you again see we're getting a little bit better fine-grained detail here. And you can see a lot more if you look at a saliency map, where with these larger patch sizes, you can see there's a lot of spurious attention, which you can also see, again, when looking directly at these attention maps. So 2 by 2 vision transformer is working better. But of course, if we wanted to go smaller, we run into memory issues. So we can try some efficient attention mechanisms, in particular using a linformer or an axial transformer. Unfortunately, neither of these are performing well. As a bit of an intuition, you can again look at the saliency maps, where you see compared to the vision transformer, there's a lot of sort of spurious attention going on, spurious correlation that's being learned by the network, unfortunately. We can try a bunch of other tricks. I won't go into the details, deeper networks, changing the hidden size, position encoding, so on. In fact, none of this offers improved performance, at least in our experiments. Finally, we can try alternative architectures. In particular, we can try a swing transformer. This is a variant of the vision transformer designed specifically for dense prediction and regression tasks. And we can see just the initial version is performing much better than the initial version of the vision transformer. And we can see with a bunch of additional tuning, it's doing rather better. But still, we're not matching the performance of the ResNet 50. And in fact, this is kind of unfortunate, but we were unable to use transformers to match the performance of ResNets, despite the fact that attention should be a different, more relaxed inductive bias where the model can learn the relationship of data across the globe better. It's not doing this, and we're not entirely sure why. You can examine these models and get some intuition. Of course, recent results with things like the forecast.net show that the transformer architecture actually can do this well, but that's using a Fourier operator to encode the data. So perhaps we need something like that. Perhaps we simply need more data or a different way to train. Future work. Now, just a brief overview of some of the lessons that we've learned from looking at these networks. First is to dig deeper when a model is performing either badly or surprisingly well. This will help inform your neural architecture design. A second is that ablation studies help build intuition and understanding. They're not perfect, but they can really help understand what's going on with the network. Thirdly, there are many ways that you can analyze and visualize neural networks. They don't have to remain black boxes. You can actually peek inside them. And we saw some of this with, for example, saliency maps, attention visualizations, and so on. And finally, as always, domain understanding for your task helps bring everything together. And with that, now I want to pivot to high-performance computing, the side of this that sort of helps enable training these neural networks. And of course, in a sense, deep learning has always been a high-performance computing problem. It is a voracious and growing demand for compute, and our models are getting ever larger and larger. But what about weather specifically? Some of these same trends hold, but there's also some differences. For example, our dataset sizes are often quite large compared to a lot of the standard deep learning benchmarks. The ENS10 dataset we've introduced is about 3 terabytes in size. All of ERA 5 is about a petabyte in size, based on my estimation from the Copernicus data store. Our data is also quite high resolution compared to standard image data. The ENS10 is 360 by 720 at the 0.5 degree resolution, and it has 7 variables on 11 pressure levels. So this is quite a lot compared to the 224 by 224 ImageNet with RGB input channels. And of course, this is likely not actually high resolution enough for production quality work. And of course, our model sizes are always growing. So first, I'm going to look at some work we've done to deal with our data, our I/O bottleneck, and then some work on how we train neural architectures a little more computationally efficiently. So the first work here is NOPFS, or NoPFS, depending on how you'd like to pronounce it. Now, this is a distributed cache and I/O middleware that, in fact, knows the future and can use this to decide where to cache and where to fetch data from most efficiently in order to deal with this major I/O bottleneck that we have during training. Now, I'll just be very brief here. This work was originally published at Supercomputing in 2021, so you can check out that paper and talk for more details. But the key observation first is that each sample is seen once per epoch when you're doing standard mini-batch stochastic gradient descent. So if you do this and you know the access sequence, then you can in fact compute this access distribution. And what this is the number of samples that are accessed a given number of times by a single process across the entirety of training. And we can see in this particular configuration, they're averaging around 6 times per sample. However, there's a very long tail here. Some samples are accessed a lot more frequently, and we can use this disparity to do caching and to cache the samples that are accessed most frequently by a processor. And to do this, we take advantage of the fact that we're not actually doing random sampling. We're doing pseudo-random sampling. We are using a pseudo-random number generator, and we know the seed. So given that we know the seed, we can compute the complete access sequence over the entirety of training for every processor. And with that, we can compute this access distribution, this access frequency distribution. And of course, we'll see that some samples are accessed very frequently by a processor, some a little less frequently, and so on. And this is how we decide where to cache. The samples that are accessed most frequently are cached locally in very fast storage, for example, DRAM. The ones that are accessed a little less frequently are cached, for example, in a node local SSD. And you can repeat this for as many storage hierarchies as you have. And we can fill this cache in the optimal order because we know the order these samples will be accessed in. But because NOPS is a distributed cache, any samples that are not cached locally, we can fetch from remote workers. And we decide where and how to fetch using a performance model that I won't get into here, but that allows us to make these decisions very efficiently. If you're interested in more details or in using NOPS, it's available on GitHub, so I encourage you to check it out. Let's just look quickly at some performance. These are some results that were run on the Lassen supercomputer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is a fairly complex storage hierarchy. And we can see that for ImageNet 22K, a fairly large data set, we're nearly 2.5x faster using NOPS over vanilla PyTorch. And for the CosmoFlow dataset from the MLPerf HPC benchmark, we are over 2x faster, all because of optimizing the I/O for end-to-end training. So that's NOPS. That's sort of breaking the I/O bottleneck. But what about training itself? And I want to talk now briefly about DaCeML. This is some new work that's appearing at ICS this year, in fact, this week. But the sort of the motivating factor here is, while these standard neural network architectures are great, and they've been very well optimized by the community and by these machine learning frameworks, we often want to explore, especially in the context of weather, more bespoke architectures. Maybe we want to tweak something. Maybe we want to incorporate some physics, so on. But this actually becomes quite difficult. The existing machine learning frameworks are sort of boxing us into existing standard architectures because they perform well. And you can't optimize your neural network training easily in these frameworks. But DaCeML solves this. DaCeML takes a data-centric view to this. And by data-centric, I mean looking at the data flow through the neural network during training, not the dataset data-centric version from Andrew Ng. Just want to make sure that's clear. So DaCeML is a framework that sits on top of other frameworks. We primarily focus on PyTorch, but this works with other frameworks like TensorFlow as well. And you essentially write your neural network just as you would, and then you simply add this DaCe module decorator, and then DaCe will take it from there. I'm just going to give a very quick overview of this. But DaCe will internally export this through the ONNX and do symbolic shape inference to understand exactly what your neural network is doing, and then use the stateful data flow multigraph, SDFG intermediate representation, to do a multi-level optimization via progressive lowering, and finally produce optimized code. Now, this goes through a few different steps. First, we start with coarse-grained transformations. Then we move on to local data movement reduction. And at this point, we do symbolic automatic differentiation, not on your original neural network graph, but on this lowered and optimized SDFG. This is very powerful. It lets you do a lot of optimizations that you couldn't do easily before, and means you don't have to hand write optimized backward kernels for all your operators. And not only that, this natively incorporates things like recomputation, where you may decide to recompute some activations during backpropagation or to stash them and reuse them from memory, all just a data-centric optimization. Next, we do global data layout optimizations, moving beyond the standard peephole optimizations that have often been done by compilers. And lastly, we do hardware specialization to generate the best code for your platform, be this a CPU, a GPU, or an FPGA. Now, that's the optimization pipeline, and this can all be applied automatically with the default recipe that we have. But this may not be enough. You may want additional performance. And at this point, DACE can be user-guided. You can intervene easily and decide what additional optimizations you want to do. And indeed, you can do this through an interactive interface that we support in VS Code for applying transformations, exploring data movement, and understanding your neural network. Now, if you're interested, DaCeML is available on GitHub, and you can check out the paper on this again for additional details. Just a quick look at some performance. DaCeML supports a wide variety of neural networks with our automatic optimization, from things like ResNet 50 to WaveNet and DLRM. And on all of these, we are at or beating the state-of-the-art for performance in both forward and backward propagation. And in fact, you can see this sort of library jail that I was talking about before. Consider wide ResNet 50-2, which is ResNet 50, but roughly you've doubled the number of filters in each of your bottleneck blocks. Naively, you would expect this to take about twice as long to run. However, for some art frameworks, it takes significantly more than twice as long. Primarily because, we believe, they've been optimizing specifically for ResNet 50 and are not able to match these optimizations in the case of wide ResNet 50-2. However, DaCeML has no problem with this. Now, if you want to jump into the driver's seat, you can manually optimize further. And using this in our VS Code interface, we're delivering state-of-the-art performance on two highly contested and well-optimized neural networks, EfficientNet and BERT-Large. So that's DaCeML. Now I just want to wrap up. We've seen a lot of stuff. First, we introduced the ENS10 dataset, a dataset for post-processing numerical weather prediction ensembles. Then we looked at how you delve deeper into understanding the accuracy and performance of your neural network architectures. Next, we talked about NOFs, an I/O middleware that we have for optimizing deep learning I/O. And finally, we talked about DaCeML, a data-centric machine learning framework that can deliver improved performance on a whole variety of different neural network architectures. And with that, I want to conclude, and thank you for your time.